So, the fuel tank is supposed to slide between the boot floor and this cross member. Now that gap is less than 3.5 inches. And the plastic tank is more like 5 inches. So this cross member carries the gearbox mounts on those two, and the tank straps, and this fuel accumulator, and that's about it. So I'm thinking if I get rid of it, time to get cutting. That's one side chopped through. Beautiful. So the cross member's out. Just left with these nubs to try and get rid of. Hammer and chisel should get rid of most of that. Get that nice and flush, and then have a look about bolting the tank in. So there's the old cross member, kindly being modelled by Hank here. And over here, behind the rakes, is this, which is going to be our new cross member. So this is a bit of 40mm square box section with very big wall thickness, don't know what it is off the top of my head, but nice and thick. And the gearbox mounts I've bought, they're off a Ford Cougar, and they have a 40mm square with just a bolt that goes through there, so that'll work out nice. Also I've got to weld some flanges on the sides, but need to get the fuel tank lined up first and bolted in, and then we can have a look at gearbox mount and gearbox. So I obviously love making work for myself. Here's the gearbox that came out of the 924. Here are the gearbox mounts, completely mullered. And as I said, I've chopped out the cross member, so I'll have to remake all that. So what I decided to do was go down a completely different route and fit an Audi 6-speed gearbox out of an A6. So here I'm pulling the stub axles out of the gearbox because they need to be skimmed down so that I can fit the adapter rings for the drive shaft, so I can use the standard 924 drive shafts. I'm just using the trusty slide hammer that I made, and they should just pop straight out. So the stub axles measure just over 12mm. I'm going to turn these down to 8 to give me back the clearance for the adapter rings. The final drive unit on the 6-speed actually measured about 10mm narrower than the 924 box, which is what's allowed me to skim those flanges and use the adapter rings. Here you can see me using the old Bridgeport mill to drill out the holes in the adapter rings. Time to check I got the maths right. Wow, look at that. Move on to the second set of holes now. Match the Porsche gearbox. So I drilled and tapped the next set of holes at 90 degrees to the first ones, just to make sure everything's evenly spaced. onto the lathe to skim them down to the right thickness and to bore out the centres. Now the sketchy bit of parting off through the drilled holes. Just skimming down the stub axles like I mentioned earlier. These were rock hard, so it was fairly tough on the old tool. Give it a good old love tapping, get it seated. So this is the Porsche gear selector on the Audi gearbox. You see it's a bit high, but the shaft size is the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop that, weld it back together. Hopefully that lines up a bit better. So I found that a bit of the gearbox casting was getting in the way, so I had to chop that off. Being the scavenger that I am, I tried to use as much of the existing Porsche stuff as I could, so I didn't have to spend any money. I modified the existing Porsche gear linkage to fit the 6-speed box, but as you can see, it put it in completely the wrong place, so I had to extend the rod. Just cut the rod and welded a bit of bar between. Seemed to work pretty well on the floor, but as we'll find out later, it didn't exactly line up that great. So I've got this position now where I think it's got to go. That's the neutral position. So mark where that lines up with the flat on the selector rod. I'm going to drill a lock bolt like that, but so it lines up with the flat. There we go. Now I'll just give this a quick paint. So the hole in the gearbox that the selector rod is going through is actually the slave cylinder mounting hole on the 6-speed, but it lines up pretty well with where the selector rod comes through on the Porsche gearbox. So I just had to bore that hole out, make it a bit bigger. The 924 gearbox is only held on with 4 bolts, funnily enough, and they all lined up great with the 6-speed box. But I found that instead of an adapter plate, I still needed a spacer plate to make sure that the drive shafts lined up better with the final drive unit on the transaxle. Pretty pleased with that. Looks almost professional. Next step was to move on to the shaft coupler. So on the Porsche, instead of having like a male and a female coupler, you have the male torque tube shaft and you have the male input shaft of the gearbox, so they need to be connected with a splined tube. So what I did was cut the centre out of an Audi A6 clutch friction disc and then chopped down the original tube and made a coupler sleeve. And then all I had to do was weld the whole shebang together. As you can see, slides nicely on the gearbox because obviously it's the clutch centre made for that gearbox. Here you can see me cutting out the spacer plate on a machine that is probably twice as old as I am. So the weather has been absolutely awful recently. As you can see, it's all muddy and gross. There's water sitting in the bottom of the gearbox there. But I finally finished this coupler. So that should, a bit tight, slide on there. And then that links to the torque tube. So after I struggled for far longer than I should have done trying to fit the gearbox, I realised it wasn't going to clear the spare wheel well. But as you can see, this thing's rusty anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I decided to channel my inner Lipu and start chopping up the car again.
At the end of his meditations, Lipu is his new car, squatting down like a big-bummed sumo wrestler.
Yeah, so that was pretty rusty anyway. My plan is to box this back this way a little bit, remove this part, make that flat with that panel there, so you can still get the spare wheel in, because I only need about 20 mil. Yeah, about that much, so less than what that is. So I've chopped out as much as I think I've got to chop out, so I've got to clean up the edges and that. But pop that in, bring that up against that edge. Loads of space. Here you can see me welding the flanges onto that bit of old box section I found to make the cross member. Now I did an absolutely masterful job of cutting this to length. It was the exact right width between the chassis rails, but unfortunately it didn't work. Rolling up a bit of sheet steel to make the spare wheel well. So as you can see, I've trial fit the gearbox. Got it all in there, make sure it actually fits. Had to chop out quite a bit of the spare wheel well here. This is a replacement panel that I'm making because it was rotten, which made me not feel too bad about having to chop some out, but quite a bit had to come out. So now I've got to drop it back out, make sure the fuel tank all fits, pop it back in and go from there. I've got my cross member mocked up roughly where it's got to go. It's got to go a little bit higher, but obviously I haven't got the tank in yet. So I've got to drop the gearbox back out and have a look. After a bit of trial fitting with the plastic tank, decided this bracket has to die. That honestly couldn't be a tighter fit. If I tried, that's literally touching the chassis rails on both sides. So that means my cross member plan, which was to have them tuck under there, that ain't gonna work. So I've got the fuel tank bolted in. I've got the bolts at the front there. Got to make the straps for the back, but I want to put the gearbox back in and make sure everything's gonna clear. So after struggling for about an hour to get this gearbox in on my own, gave up and enlisted the help of my dad, and it went straight in.